wants me to tell you to put up your cell phones and listen, because there's some things that you're going to take away from this that are going to empower you and going to change the way that you think and really make you think about the pathology that we have as a people. So I want you to sort of pay attention if you can, and I'll try to keep you interested, all right? Come on now, I'm black. I believe in call and response. I say all right, you say okay. All right? All right, wonderful, wonderful. Before I get started, I want to sort of tell you, give you a little bit of preface about how I came to this particular topic. I think about a year or two ago, I was reading a book by Tom Burrell called Brainwash, Challenging the Myth of Black Inferiority. Whenever you guys get a chance, I encourage you to pick up that book. But what this brother talks about in this particular book, Mr. Burrell is an advertising executive. And what he sort of analyzes in this particular book is this whole notion that since America's start, since its inception, it's been engaged in an all-out war to denigrate the image of people of color, but specifically black folks. Does that make sense to us? If I could get more specific with you, what Mr. Burrell is explaining in this book is how mediated images, everybody say mediated images.
Mediated images.
Mediated images that we see, such as commercials with the Pine Sol lady, where she does these. I have a habit of doing impressions, y'all forgive me. Where the Pine Sol lady sort of, you know, when she goes to these people's houses, she's like, baby, I'll clean your house for you real good. You know, sort of these mammy images that we see on a constant basis, right? I think Bell Hooks talks about the 3 images that we see most often of black women, and she says, excuse my French, but I'm using these words not for gratuitous profanity purposes, but just so that you can get the general imagery. She talks about how often black women are portrayed in 3 very specific ways: bitches, mammies, and whores. Bitches would be that neck-turning, finger-pointing, going off at the drop of a hat. Mammy, that mothering image, and the whore, that highly promiscuous woman. Okay? And believe it or not, even though these are images that are hundreds of years old, we still see these very same images perpetuated and propagated within the context of the media. Well, you may be saying, Dr. Hall, what does that have to do with the Harlem Renaissance? It has everything to do with it. Because when W.E.B. Du Bois was saying that all art is propaganda, what he was saying, because you've been hearing this since yesterday, what he was essentially saying is that whatever artistry is used, even if it's just a song, even if it's just a TV show, it is disseminating some type of information about the people who it is about. Everybody still following me here, right? Now, when you think about the time, because time is everything, if you think about the time of the Harlem Renaissance, which was around the 1920s, you're thinking about people who were really living during the Jim Crow era, not that far removed from slavery. So most of the mediated images that you would see of these people happen to be very, very negative. You see a lot of images of mammies and symbols, images of people in blackface, images of people who, as they say, were shucking and jiving, people who were very, very lazy, very complacent, things that were really, really antithetical to who black people really are. And by antithetical, I mean in opposition to who we really are. So what Du Bois was advocating was that we use our artistry, which we know is still very much loved by people of all races and colors. How many of us can agree on that? Okay? And if you really think about it, let's just be, can I be, as I tell my students, can I keep it 100 with you? There is no true American art form or true musical art form that is American that was not created by black folks. There would be no rock and roll if they were not for the black creator, Chuck Berry. Not Elvis, even though everybody likes to call him the King. He is not so. There would be no gospel music. There would be no, and this surprises folks, but the first country and western singer was a black man. And so there's really no truly American form of music were it not for the black inventor or the creativity or creative genius of black folks. So what Du Bois is saying is, since we have these God-given talents, why not use them to redefine how it is that we're seeing to the outside world and create a more more humane perspective of us as a people, because it was his whole intent to create sort of a equality in the eyes of other people. Can we switch? So the title of my work is The Harlem Renaissance, the Literary Foundation and Pedagogical Impetus for the Artistry of the African Diaspora. Now that's kind of wordy, so I'm going to break it down to you and explain to you what it means. The Harlem Renaissance essentially was one of the first documented literary times or literary periods within the African American community. I'm not saying it was the first, but it was one of the first documented. Okay? Now what happens is that the movements / literary periods that come thereafter were very much influenced by the Harlem Renaissance, such as the La Negritude movement, which was the sort of the Black French equivalent of the Harlem Renaissance. And then much later you have the Black Arts movement, or Black Power / Black Arts movement, which was also influenced by the tenets of the Harlem Renaissance. And by pedagogical impetus, meaning that they taught these other preceding artists and literarians how it is that Black art should be done. They talked about, or they carried on the notion that Black art should not just be aesthetic, but that it should be didactic and utilitarian at the same time. Didactic meaning that it should teach lessons and be purposeful, and utilitarian meaning that it should be useful. Now this is very interesting, because what this does is it follows a very, very Afrocentric concept. Because when you look at the art of our ancestors, which was a lot of times oral artistry or orature, you find that this oral artistry was didactic and utilitarian, which is very much different from Western artistry, which is usually art for art's sake. I'll give you an example. How many of you have ever been to a museum before? Okay? And you know how when we go to a museum, let's say, for instance, I'm going to step behind and don't look down at my feet because I'm going to keep my tennis shoes on, okay? When we go to a museum, notice that one of the things that we see, we look at the paintings, right, from a Western perspective. And we'll look at a Van Gogh, we'll look at a Degas, we'll look at a Picasso, and the things that we notice are like the art strokes, right? We notice if it's abstract, we notice the colors, the echo, and these sort of things. Everything that applies to the aesthetic value, the beauty of the picture. In a very different vein, notice that whenever you look at the art of African or diasporic Africans, meaning African or Black folks in other places around the world, it always has a multi-purpose. Give an example of familiar artistry to you. Quilts. While a quilt may be beautiful, it also encompasses the history of the family. It encompasses different family values. Like, say, for instance, you may have a quilt that your grandmother or great-grandmother passed down, and the quilt will have a piece of your grandfather's coat from World War II. It'll have a piece of your great-great-grandmother's wedding dress. It will have a piece of your mother's baby christening gown. And so what that does is that shows us how our art is purposeful, useful, and teaches lessons at the same time. And so when we talk about when we talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, this is what he wanted us to include in our work. How do I switch this?
There's an arrow.
Okay. Now, I included this picture because I wanted us to just get sort of I wanted us to get a tangible example in our minds of some of the images that they were fighting against. Because these images created the notion of subjugated peoples, inferior peoples, who were very much limited in their human capacity, if that makes sense to you. Okay? So, what he says in Du Bois's paper, or in Du Bois's work, The Criteria of Negro Art, he sort of gives a mandate to the artisans, telling them why it is that they needed to include portions of their history and why they needed to give voice to the people who were considered a voiceless people. He says, part of the great fight we are carrying on, and it represents a forward and upward look, a pushing onward. Meaning that this is not just about writing short stories. This is not about just writing poetry or essays, but this is about giving voice to a people who for hundreds of years have struggled, and it has been not only taboo for them to tell their truth, but greatly it has been unheard of, because when you think about the literature from black artisans before the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of this was, I don't want to say mimicry, but a lot of it was sort of formulated with this whole idea that they had to mimic who they considered to be great white artists. Is everybody still on the same page with me? Okay? So when I talk about the whole notion of it being a pedagogical impetus for the African diaspora, it taught others how to tell their stories. Toni Morrison said something years ago, which I think is very apropos here. She says that the definitions belong to the definers. One of the major points of the Harlem Renaissance and the preceding African American and diasporic African movements around the world was that we were, as a people, trying to redefine the images that we had been given. It's very much like today. I'll give you an example. I want to make a contemporary connection for you. One of the problems that I have with hip-hop as a hip-hop aficionado, I love hip-hop, that's what I'm saying. As a hip-hop aficionado, is that we're letting record companies and people who are outside of the cultural community create for us how it is that we should be seen. And unfortunately, because we're constantly bombarded with these images, we begin to buy into who they say we are. Is everybody still following? Okay? But what has to happen is that we've got to get to a place where we stop allowing people to define for us who it is that we are, and we tell them who it is that we are. And so this is why movements like the Harlem Renaissance were so very important to black culture and to black people, because it sought to change the pathology, and pathology means like almost like a sick way of thinking, that people were thinking in a particular way that was detrimental to who they are. So it seeks to change the pathology of black folks. Because you think about it, again, with this whole notion of art being propaganda or mediated images being propaganda, when you think about it, think about the effects that years or centuries of bombardment of negative images will have on a certain group of people. I think about it even in terms of, let's say for instance, I think yesterday one of the presenters talked about how Alain Locke received a lot of disgruntled messages from people who were asking him why was it that in his art exhibits he included so many dark-skinned black people? Why didn't he have light-skinned black people? And these were the messages he was getting from other black people. Now one would ask, now why would they have a problem with him representing different aspects of the culture? Why would they have a problem with dark people being represented? Because they had but they had bought into this whole notion of the closer it is to white, the more beautiful it is. And so when we talk about movements like the Harlem Renaissance or La Negritude and the Black Arts Movement, what we're talking about is people who sought for us to get an understanding of black empowerment, for us to begin to embrace our black selves, and for us to explain the necessity and the danger of our struggle. Is everybody still following? Mm-hmm. Okay? The second thing we said is it taught the community to embrace and give voice to the black experience. And one of the, there's a poem by Claude McKay that I think encompasses the black struggle before the Harlem Renaissance, and even now to some degree. The poem is called If We Must Die, and I want to recite it quickly and tell you what it has to do with what we're talking about. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mark at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murder's cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. This poem by McKay was sort of a poetic manifesto for the necessity of black empowerment. Because what he was saying was essentially is that we must continue to fight to maintain and gain some semblance of equality and justice for the centuries of mistreatment that our people or the black culture or black people have been going through. And if you want to be honest about it, he was even more so in being influenced by the Garveyite rhetoric that was going on at the time. How many of you are familiar with Marcus Garvey? Very few hands went up. But Marcus Garvey was a very, very revolutionary man, especially when you consider the time frame. This was the 1920s. Marcus Garvey started an organization called UNIA, which is the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was a movement that was not only trying to advocate black folks go back to Africa, their homeland, but also that black folks began to embrace Africa as a homeland. Because during this media campaign, or this sort of this propaganda that was being disseminated, most people began to think of Africa as this uncivilized place where people walked around naked with bones through their noses, okay? And they lived in huts. Unfortunately, a lot of folks still believe this. But what Marcus Garvey was advocating was that these people were a people of a history. These people were a people who had a place, a home. They had ancestors who did great things. Thus, they were capable of even greater things. So I think it's important for us to understand that the Harlem Renaissance was not just a literary period, but it was about a movement that sought to change the hearts and minds of a people and sought to change some of the ways of thinking that continue to not only degrade us, but denigrate ourselves, cause us to denigrate ourselves, and cause us to be dehumanized in the eyes of others. And I think that's my time. I got 2 more minutes, okay. One more thing before I leave. And so, when we talk about changing the minds, there's a book by Paulo Freire called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it simply means that the oppressed are taught in particular ways that maintain their oppression. And one of the things that Paulo says that I think is very, very apropos here is that freedom is never free. That those who get freedom must continue to fight to maintain their freedom. The Bible says something very similar. The Bible says that we'll say the kingdom of heaven, right? But we'll change that with freedom. Those who want freedom suffer violence, and the violent have to take it by force. Meaning that freedom is never just going to be given to you, but you have to continue to fight to maintain it. Does everybody understand where we're going with this? And one of the issues that we're having today is we don't understand that we're still not entirely free. Because when you think about what it has to do with you as young people, is that when Du Bois and Garvey and all of these other people were advocating that we change our pathologies and that we change the way that we're seen in the outside world, they knew that these things affected us not only socially, but these things affected us financially and psychologically. Meaning they affected even the way that we saw ourselves, the ways that we socialized with the outside world, and the way the outside world socialized with us. But also they affected our pockets. Because a lot of times when we would try to get jobs or try to advance professionally, what the people saw was not truly a black person, but they saw a minstrel figure. They saw a stereotype. And so this is why it is so important that we understand that there's still work to do, or there's still a job ahead. I thank you for listening, and I thank you for your time.